In the late summer of 378 AD, a Roman emperor named Valens stood on a hill outside the city of Adrianople and looked down at a camp of wagons, tents, and cattle spread across the plain below. He had one of the largest field armies the Eastern Roman Empire could assemble, somewhere close to 20,000 professional soldiers, armored, drilled, and disciplined in tactics refined over 700 years of continuous warfare. Below him were the Goths, not a nation, not an army in the Roman sense. A moving mass of families, tribal war bands, and refugees who had crossed into Roman territory 2 years earlier, starving, disarmed at the border, and treated so badly by the officials meant to feed them that they had taken up arms rather than die quietly. Valens did not wait for reinforcements marching from the west. He did not wait for a clearer picture of Gothic strength. He attacked immediately, confident that Roman legions had never lost to a barbarian horde in open battle. And by the end of that single afternoon, 2/3 of his army was dead, and Valens himself was gone, his body never recovered. It was the worst defeat Rome had suffered in centuries, and it happened not because the Goths had better weapons, better armor, or better tactics. It happened because an empire that had spent 7 centuries perfecting one way of winning wars could no longer imagine losing to people it did not consider a real army at all. To understand how strange this outcome actually is, you need to understand what Rome was in 378. This was not a fragile, declining state stumbling toward its end. Rome still controlled territory stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. Its legions were the most sophisticated military instrument the ancient world had ever produced, built on centuries of standardized training, engineering, and logistics that no other force on earth could match. Roman roads connected the empire's provinces so efficiently that a legion could be moved hundreds of miles in weeks. Roman fortresses, aqueducts, and cities represented an administrative and technical achievement that would not be matched in parts of Europe for 1,000 years after Rome fell. The Goths had none of this. They had no cities of their own, no standing professional army, no treasury, no navy, no engineering corps capable of building the roads and walls that Roman civilization took for granted. They were, in the eyes of Roman writers, barbarians in the most literal sense of the word, people who did not speak Latin or Greek and therefore, by Roman logic, did not build anything worth respecting. On paper, this was not a contest between equals. It was not supposed to be a contest at all. But the paper was wrong, and it had been wrong for longer than anyone in Rome wanted to admit. The Goths who stood on that plain outside Adrianople were not simple raiders. They were a people pushed into Roman territory by a catastrophe they had not caused. In the 370s, a nomadic confederation called the Huns swept out of the Central Asian steppe with a speed and ferocity that shattered the Gothic kingdoms north of the Danube River. Entire tribal confederations that had lived in that region for generations were suddenly refugees, fleeing toward the one border they knew could offer safety, the edge of the Roman Empire itself. In 376, tens of thousands of Goths, led by chieftains named Fritigern and Alavivus, arrived at the Danube and asked Emperor Valens for permission to cross into Roman territory as subjects. This was not an invasion. It was a request for asylum. And on paper, it should have worked in Rome's favor. The empire had absorbed foreign peoples before, and a fresh population of farmers and potential soldiers was, in theory, a resource. Valens agreed to let them cross, on the condition that they surrender their weapons and submit to Roman authority. What happened next is where Rome's failure actually begins, and it has almost nothing to do with battlefield tactics. The Roman officials responsible for managing the Gothic crossing and resettlement were corrupt, and catastrophically so. Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing at the time, described local commanders selling food to the starving Goths at extortionate prices, reportedly trading dog meat for Gothic children who were then sold into slavery. Weapons that were supposed to be confiscated at the border were not fully collected because the officials overseeing the crossing were too busy profiting from bribes to enforce the policy properly. Tens of thousands of armed, furious, starving people were funneled into Roman territory by an administration that treated the entire crisis as an opportunity for personal enrichment rather than a genuine humanitarian and military situation. By the time local unrest turned into open revolt near the city of Marcianople in 377, Rome had created, through sheer bureaucratic greed and mismanagement, an armed and hostile population inside its own borders. This was not a foreign invasion. Rome had imported the crisis that would eventually help unravel it. For 2 years, The Goths fought a war of survival across the Balkans, avoiding pitched battles where possible, living off the land, absorbing escaped slaves and disaffected peasants into their ranks, and slowly becoming something more organized and dangerous than the desperate refugees who had crossed the Danube. And this is the detail that Roman commanders consistently underestimated. The Goths were not a static enemy. They were adapting in real time, incorporating Roman deserters who understood Roman tactics, acquiring captured Roman equipment, and learning, through hard experience, exactly how a Roman field army preferred to fight. When Valens finally moved to confront them near Adrianople in August of 378, he had every reason, by the standards of Roman military doctrine, to expect victory. Roman heavy infantry had beaten larger barbarian forces for centuries. What he did not account for was Gothic cavalry, away foraging when the battle began, returning at the precise moment the Roman lines were fully engaged and exhausted from the summer heat, and slamming into the Roman flank with devastating force. The Roman army, packed too tightly to maneuver, collapsed into a crushing mass where soldiers could not raise their weapons, let alone retreat. It was not a defeat born of Gothic superiority in open, organized combat. It was a defeat born of Roman overconfidence meeting a genuinely unpredictable, adaptive opponent that Roman doctrine had no framework for taking seriously. Adrianople did not end Rome, but it revealed something that Roman leadership never fully corrected over the following century, which is that Rome's military and political system had become extraordinarily good at one specific kind of war and structurally unable to adapt when that kind of war stopped being the war it was actually fighting. The Roman legion of the 4th century was the product of centuries of refinement for large, set-piece battles against organized state armies or predictable barbarian tribes fighting in familiar patterns. It excelled at sieges, at engineering, at logistics across a settled, taxed, administratively mapped empire. What it was never built for was an enemy that existed inside its borders, that could not be dislodged by capturing a capital because it had no capital, that negotiated, allied, and fought in shifting combinations depending on circumstance rather than fixed national loyalty. After Adrianople, Rome could not simply destroy the Gothic threat, because there was no single army left to destroy and no single city to capture that would end the war. Instead, in 382, the Eastern Emperor Theodosius signed a treaty allowing the Goths to settle within the empire as a semi-autonomous federated people, retaining their own leadership and military structure in exchange for nominal loyalty to Rome. It was less a victory than an admission. Rome could no longer conquer the Goths. It could only try to manage them. That arrangement held, uneasily, for roughly 25 years, and it produced the man who would do more damage to the city of Rome itself than any single figure in 700 years. Alaric was born into Gothic nobility around 370, grew up inside the Roman frontier system, and in his youth actually served as a commander of Gothic troops within the Roman military. He understood Rome from the inside in a way no earlier barbarian leader ever had. He knew its supply routes, its political fractures between the eastern and western halves of the empire, and its chronic unwillingness to pay the federated peoples it depended on for military manpower. When Rome repeatedly failed to deliver the payments, land grants, and official recognition Alaric believed his people had been promised, he did not respond with a single dramatic invasion. He responded the way a man who understood Roman weaknesses intimately would respond. He used the empire's own internal rivalries against it, playing the Eastern and Western Roman governments against each other for political leverage, extracting concessions, and building his reputation and his army's cohesion over years of calculated pressure rather than one decisive campaign. By 408, after 2 decades of broken promises, Alaric marched on Italy itself. The Western Roman government, based in the fortified city of Ravenna, refused to negotiate seriously, apparently believing that Rome's reputation alone would deter an actual attack on the ancient capital. This was, in retrospect, one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in Roman political history, and it came from the same institutional overconfidence that had doomed Valens at Adrianople 3 decades earlier. Alaric besieged the city of Rome itself 3 separate times between 408 and 410, each time offering terms, each time being stalled or refused by a Western Roman court that could not seem to grasp that the empire's aura of invincibility had already been broken on the plains outside Adrianople and had never fully recovered. On August 24th, 410, after the 3rd siege, the gates of Rome were opened, according to some accounts by slaves inside the city sympathetic to the Goths, and Alaric's forces entered the city that had not been captured by a foreign enemy in nearly 800 years. The sack lasted 3 days. It was, by the standards of ancient warfare, comparatively restrained. Churches were largely spared. Mass slaughter was limited, but the symbolic damage was immeasurable. Word spread across the entire ancient world within months. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, described being unable to speak for grief, saying that the city which had conquered the world had itself been conquered. Here is what the popular version of this story usually gets wrong. It frames the sack of Rome as the moment a barbarian horde finally overwhelmed a great civilization through raw force. That is not what the evidence shows. Alaric's Goths did not sack Rome because they had grown militarily unstoppable. They sacked Rome because a series of Western Roman administrations, generation after generation, refused to adapt their political and military relationship with the peoples living inside and along their own borders. Rome had every opportunity to integrate the Goths permanently, on stable terms, decades before 410. Roman commanders who understood the value of federated troops, men like the general Stilicho, who was himself half Vandal and who tried repeatedly to broker lasting terms with Alaric, were undermined by a Roman political culture that treated any accommodation with a barbarian leader as weakness and treated stubborn refusal to negotiate as strength, regardless of the actual balance of power on the ground. Stilicho was executed in 408 by the same government he had spent years trying to protect, accused of secretly conspiring with the very Goths he had spent his career managing. His death removed the one Roman leader who might have prevented the sack entirely, and it happened because Rome's internal political system valued the appearance of hardline strength over the substance of a workable strategy. This is the pattern that repeats across the entire collapse of the Western Roman Empire over the following 66 years, and it deserves to be named directly because it is not unique to the 4th and 5th centuries. Rome had built, over hundreds of years, an extraordinarily effective system for winning wars against organized, predictable enemies, and an equally entrenched political culture that rewarded rigid displays of dominance over flexible, adaptive strategy. Every time that system faced an opponent who did not fight the way Roman doctrine expected, a semi-integrated federated people with shifting loyalties, a fast-moving cavalry force that did not wait patiently to be crushed by heavy infantry, a population inside the empire's own borders that could not be defeated by capturing a single city. The Roman response was the same institutional reflex that had failed at Adrianople. Refuse to adapt the underlying strategy. Treat every setback as an execution problem rather than a structural one. Punish the commanders who suggested accommodation, and reward the officials who projected unshakable confidence, right up until the confidence collapsed entirely. The 46 years between the sack of Rome and the final collapse of the Western Empire were not a single dramatic slide. They were a slow accumulation of the same institutional failure repeating itself with different barbarian peoples in different provinces. The Vandals, another Germanic people pushed westward by the same pressures that had displaced the Goths, crossed from Spain into North Africa in 429 and captured Carthage, one of the wealthiest grain-producing regions in the entire empire, within a decade. Rome's response followed the now-familiar script. Treat the loss as temporary. Refuse to fundamentally renegotiate the empire's relationship with the peoples settling inside its borders. Launch expensive, poorly coordinated military expeditions to reclaim lost territory rather than accept a new political reality and adapt to it. A massive combined Eastern and Western Roman fleet sent to retake North Africa in 468 was destroyed by Vandal fire ships, a defeat so costly in ships, soldiers, and treasury that it effectively ended any realistic hope of restoring the empire's western provinces by force. In 455, the Vandals sailed on Rome itself and sacked the city a second time, more thoroughly than Alaric had 45 years earlier, while the Western Roman court, isolated in Ravenna, proved unable to muster a meaningful defense of its own former capital. By this point, the Western Roman army was not really a Roman army in any traditional sense. It was overwhelmingly composed of the same federated barbarian troops, Goths, Vandals, Huns, and other peoples that earlier generations of Roman leadership had refused to integrate on stable terms, now serving under commanders who increasingly recognized that their loyalty to a crumbling Ravenna court served them less than their own independent power would. By 476, the pattern reached its final conclusion. though by then it barely registered as a dramatic event at all. The Western Roman Empire had spent decades relying almost entirely on federated barbarian troops, Goths, Vandals, and other peoples, to staff what remained of its military, because the empire's own tax base, administrative capacity, and political will to maintain a genuinely Roman army had eroded past the point of recovery. In that year, a Germanic military commander named Odoacer, leading troops who had themselves served Rome for generations, deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, without a significant battle, without a dramatic siege, without the kind of climactic confrontation the fall of an empire is supposed to have. There was no final glorious defense. There was simply an institution that had spent a century managing its own decline through denial, finally running out of road. Odoacer did not even bother declaring himself emperor. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and governed Italy as a king, because by 476, the fiction of a functioning Western Roman government had become less useful than simply acknowledging what had already happened on the ground for decades. What actually defeated Rome was not superior Gothic weaponry, superior Gothic tactics, or superior Gothic numbers. At nearly every stage of this 200-year unraveling, Rome retained more soldiers, more wealth, more engineering capacity, and more administrative sophistication than the peoples who eventually dismantled its western half. What Rome lost was the institutional capacity to change its own operating model when the world around it had already changed. The legion system that had conquered the Mediterranean was optimized for a specific kind of enemy and a specific kind of war, and it kept being applied, generation after generation, to threats it was no longer suited for, because changing it meant admitting that the system that had built the empire was no longer the system that could preserve it. Commanders who recognized this, like Stilicho, were treated as threats to be eliminated rather than assets to be empowered. Emperors who recognized this, like Theodosius after Adrianople, were remembered by later Roman writers not as pragmatists who saved what could be saved, but as men who had shamefully negotiated with barbarians instead of defeating them outright. This is not a uniquely ancient failure. It is the same competency trap that has dismantled dominant institutions throughout history and continues to dismantle them today. An organization builds a system that wins decisively within a particular environment. That system becomes deeply embedded in its culture, its training, its promotion structures, and its identity. When the environment shifts, when the nature of the competition changes into something the winning formula was never designed to handle, the institution's instinct is not to rebuild the formula. Its instinct is to apply the old formula harder, to treat every failure as a problem of execution rather than of strategy, and to sideline the people inside the organization who are actually pointing out that the game itself has changed. The parallels show up again and again in institutions that have nothing to do with 4th century warfare. A company that dominates its industry through one particular product architecture develops an entire culture, an entire promotion ladder, and an entire supplier network built around defending that architecture. When a genuinely different kind of competitor appears, one that does not play by the old rules, the dominant company's instinct is almost never to rebuild itself from scratch. Its instinct is to defend the system that made it great, treating every early loss as a marketing problem or an execution problem rather than a sign that the underlying model has already been surpassed. Blockbuster did not lose to Netflix because it lacked capital, brand recognition, or retail expertise. It had all three in overwhelming abundance. It lost because its entire operating identity, thousands of physical stores, a business model built partly on late fees, a culture that measured success in foot traffic, made a subscription-based mail and streaming model feel like a threat to be contained rather than a shift to be embraced. Kodak invented digital photography inside its own labs in the 1970s and buried the technology because its entire corporate structure, its profits, its factories, its identity, was built around chemical film. Rome's legions and Rome's political class faced the same essential problem in the 4th century. The Gothic style of war, decentralized, adaptive, unwilling to fight on Roman terms, was not a threat Roman doctrine was built to recognize as legitimate, and so for decades, Roman leadership kept applying the old formula, punishing the men who suggested otherwise, until the old formula simply stopped producing victories at all. Rome had 400 years of continuous success validating its military and political doctrine by the time the Goths crossed the Danube in 376. That record of success was not a guarantee of future dominance. It was the exact reason Rome could not see, until it was far too late, that the war it was fighting by 378 was not the war its entire system had been built to win. Every emperor who tried to adapt, to negotiate, to integrate rather than conquer, was remembered by contemporaries not as a realist managing an impossible situation, but as a man who had betrayed Roman strength. Every emperor who refused to adapt, who insisted on meeting a fundamentally new kind of threat with the same rigid doctrine that had built the empire, was celebrated for his resolve right up until that resolve produced catastrophe. The empire that had conquered the known world was not destroyed by a stronger enemy. It was undone by its own inability to imagine that the rules had already changed while it was still congratulating itself on having written them. A barefoot, undisciplined, cityless people had outlasted the most sophisticated military machine on earth, not because they became stronger than Rome, but because Rome never stopped being exactly what it had always been, in a world that had already moved on.